Welcome to another episode of Ask an Economist. I'm Matt Grudnoff.
And I'm Eliza Littleton.
And we're economists.
In today's episode, we're going to answer the questions: how will the government pay back all that debt? How are rich men avoiding paying tax? And are tens of thousands of children in poverty because of government policy?
If you want to send in a question, you can send a voice memo to mail@australiainstitute.org.au with the line, Ask an Economist.
Our first question this week is from Cheryl, and she asks, are politicians using public debt to create fear that each taxpayer will be burdened for generations under crippling debt? And how and when does the government debt at the Reserve Bank get retired?
The old government debt is a problem. Yes, that's a almost uniquely Australian obsession. And because we're obsessed with it, Australia is actually a very low debt country, public debt country. Compared to other developed countries, we have very little debt. So how does the government raise debt? Well, the government has its own bank called the Reserve Bank of Australia. So when you want to borrow money for a mortgage or a car or something like that, you go down to your local bank, and after shopping around, and everybody out there should shop around if you're getting a mortgage to get the best deal, you pick a bank, okay, and you go with their terms and conditions. Well, the government has a much better way of doing it. They actually own their own bank, the Reserve Bank of Australia, and that's who they borrow it from. Now, when you try to raise money for a mortgage, say you want to borrow $500,000 to buy a house, you could just go to one bank and they'll happily give you the money if they think that you're a good credit risk. But when the government wants to raise, say, $100 million, there's not really one entity that's going to lend them all that money. So rather than have just one person raise money for government debt, what they do is they cut them up into tiny little IOUs called bonds, and they issue lots of them. So in the same way that Telstra is a big company that's cut up into lots of little shares, and if you own a Telstra share, then you own a bit of Telstra and you have the right to some of that profit if they make any. Large debts, like the ones that governments raise, is cut up into lots of smaller things called bonds. And that basically means that you get paid an interest on that bond. And then when the bond expires, the government will give you the entire amount back. So if the government wanted to raise $100 billion, it might cut it up into $1 million $100 bonds. And you could buy one or more of those bonds, and that might entitle you to a certain amount of money each year, and then at the end of the term of the bond, say it's a 10-year bond, in the 10th year, you get your $100 back.
In the last year, when the government has had to borrow a lot of money to cover different stimulus packages to address COVID, they've actually borrowed that at such a low interest rate. It got down to a low of 1%. And every year, the economy grows usually faster, or like
about 3.5% is the long-term growth rate for the economy.
Exactly, 3.5%. So as the economy grows, we're actually growing faster than the interest that we have to pay back on debt that we'll pay back in 30 years or so.
Yeah, so if you're borrowing at 1%, even the inflation rate, just the standard CPI increases on average at about 2.5%. So if you've locked in a 1% interest rate for the next 30 years, then you're going to be paying back in future dollars that are so much more valuable than now, and effectively you're reducing the debt just through inflation and economic growth. We're often told that government debt is a problem, that it's a burden on future generations, as our question said. And is that true? Well, the first thing to remember is that a debt might be something the government has to pay back, but a debt is also an asset for the person who owns it. Just in the same way that banks are busily trying to get you to borrow money, they're quite happy for you to want a mortgage. In fact, they chase customers to get a mortgage. Why? Because they know that they can make money from it. And so all these government bonds out there are actually assets to the people who own it. And many people out there probably own government bonds and don't even realise it through their superannuation funds. So you probably got government debt in your superannuation fund, and you certainly don't view it as a burden. It's actually an asset that's going to help fund your retirement. So the thing to remember is that while it might be a liability for the government, it's actually an asset for the person who owns it. And the other really important thing at the moment to remember is that the government's undertaking what's called quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing is basically the polite way of saying printing money. So reckless people print money, reckless governments print money, good governments quantitative ease. They're exactly the same thing, but that's the central bank nice way of saying printing money. And so at the moment, what the government's actually doing is it's getting the Reserve Bank to create money and using that money to buy, in part, government debt. So effectively, one of the biggest owners of government debt is the government. Their left pocket owes their money to their right pocket. And what's really crazy is that the Reserve Bank will eventually make the government pay that debt back. So it'll basically pay the debt back to itself. If we then look at whether or not, as they ask, is this a burden for generations to come? Well, that really depends. And the really important thing, a way of thinking that is if in the future we decide, look, we really need to reduce debt, that the most important thing the government can do is to reduce government debt, well then, how do they do that? Well, usually the government will come along and they'll have some kind of austerity budget, usually after an election. You don't want to have an austerity budget before an election, but after an election, and they'll talk about cutting hospital funding or, making it more expensive to go to GPs or cutting education or, all these kind of different cuts. So what you're really asking is will the next generation benefit if we cut funding to hospitals that the next generation will be born into? Will they be better off if we cut education funding to the schools and the universities that they'll be educated in? And will they be better off if we didn't engage in stimulus spending, and so therefore unemployment was higher, so when they're trying to first break into the job market and there's high unemployment, they can't get a job? And obviously, no. The future generations are totally going to benefit from good hospital funding, good education funding, and low unemployment.
So what you're saying, Matt, is if we really care about what is going to be a burden for future generations, we should actually be looking at what the government is cutting and not at the debt that they're racking up.
Absolutely right. Now, if you want to send in a question like Cheryl did, you can send a voice memo to mail@australiainstitute.org.au with the line, Ask an Economist. Our next question is, who benefits the most from large tax concessions?
Well, Matt, research that the Australia Institute just released suggests that men are the main beneficiaries of tax concessions. The research looks at 4 of the biggest tax concessions: negative gearing, capital gains tax discount, excess franking credits, and superannuation tax concessions. And it basically found that on average, men get 70% of these tax concessions and women get 30%, around 30% of these tax concessions.
But is that just because men pay more tax, so therefore they get a larger slice of the tax concessions?
That is part of the story. So men, they pay around 65% of all tax that's collected from individuals and incomes, compared to women who pay 35%. So men are still disproportionately benefiting from tax concessions, but...
So they pay 65% of the tax, but they get 70% of the tax concessions. So
exactly.
They're still getting far more.
Yeah, so men definitely get far more of the tax concessions than women when we take into consideration how much tax they pay. But this also masks a different story as well, which is that men pay more tax because they earn more money. And this reflects the fact that women experience lots of structural disadvantage in our labour markets. So we know that women are overrepresented in part-time employment and insecure work. In low-wage industries like health and education, and women are expected to do a disproportionate amount of the unpaid labour, which means that in the end, women earn less money, and also it means that they reap far fewer benefits from tax concessions. And considering tax concessions are supposed to be actually an equaliser in society, that is, that people who earn a lot of money contribute more to tax, and then this gets distributed to people who earn less money and need support and help.
Yeah, and so how big are these tax concessions we're talking about?
Really big. So this research report that just came out calculated that the 4 big tax concessions are worth $60 billion to the government each year. And to put this into perspective, the government spend about $39 billion on education and $29 billion on defence. So it's a lot of money.
Way more than
it's
defence
way more.
And education.
Exactly. So basically, Matt, these tax concessions exacerbate existing labour market inequalities that disproportionately disadvantage women. The third question is, the government has increased the base rate of JobSeeker to $50 per fortnight. Won't this make the unemployed better off?
Well, you'd think so, and if you were just listening to the government, you might think that that was absolutely the case. And the government has increased the base rate of JobSeeker by $50 a fortnight, which is a pretty paltry increase. I think it increases it from $40 a day to about $43, $44 a day. But the reality is, even this increase is actually a cut. So what the government is doing at exactly the same time as it's increased the base rate by $50 is it's got rid of this thing called the coronavirus supplement that it introduced during the pandemic. And that supplement is worth at the moment, or was worth before they cut it, $150 a fortnight. So they're giving the unemployed $50 with one hand and taking $150 away with the other. So the unemployed are actually worse off $100 per fortnight. Now, the coronavirus supplement, when it was first introduced, wasn't $150 a fortnight. It was actually $550 a fortnight, and it almost doubled the rate of JobSeeker unemployment payments. And that was the biggest poverty alleviation policy in Australia's history. It dragged 500,000 people, including 75,000 children, out of poverty. That one policy, that one decision by government, dragged 500,000 people out of poverty. So what the government showed with that single great policy was that poverty, to a large extent, is a policy choice. The government can solve this poverty problem. Maybe not completely, but they can certainly dramatically reduce it very easily. After doing this great work, the problem is the government then, over the next year, so from April, at the beginning of April when it first came in last year, all the way through to the beginning of April now when they've cut it completely, they basically systematically cut it. And along with the fact that unemployment was growing through this period, what's actually happened is an additional 1 million Australians have entered poverty now because of this cut and because of the growing unemployment. And that includes 220,000 children. And the reason we keep talking about children is because it's really important. If a child lives in poverty, then that will affect the child's development, including its emotional development, its behavioural development. It affects it, and even if it then in adulthood is not in poverty, those effects are permanent. And so it's really important that children not live in poverty. And yet we've got these huge hundreds of thousands of children in poverty, essentially because of a policy decision by the government. But it doesn't actually have to be that way. Research that we've released has shown that if the government just reinstituted the original $550 a fortnight coronavirus supplement, so rather than getting rid of the supplement, they just brought it back in at the full rate, that would mean, again, 500,000 Australians would be pulled out of poverty, including 90,000 children. So 90,000 children would not be living in poverty if the government went back and reinstituted the full coronavirus supplement.
And we know that JobSeeker currently costs $10 billion, and to double it, let's say it would cost another $10 billion. And as I've already highlighted, if we wound back some of the tax concessions, which, let's be honest, mostly benefit wealthy people and are worth around $60 billion, we could absolutely pay for a doubling of the JobSeeker payment.
So we can see that this makes a dramatic difference to people's lives. We know that when the coronavirus supplement came in, there were all kinds of reports and various organisations found that people were paying for medical care, they were paying for dental care, they were buying shoes for their kids for school, they were buying fresh fruit and vegetables. They were actually able to get ahead and stay afloat and stay out of poverty because of this policy. So really, call on the government that they need to put unemployment payments at a level that keeps people out of poverty. This idea that we need to keep people in poverty is just wrong. We're a rich country at the richest time in history. We don't need to be this cruel to our unemployed people.
Thanks for watching another episode of Ask an Economist. If you want to send in one of your own questions, you can stick it in a voice memo or email us at mail@australiainstitute.org.au. And make sure that you put Ask an Economist as the subject line.